for this purpose. And it's my pleasure to welcome to campus for this purpose also a long-standing friend and colleague, Lenny Benardo, who is the Executive Vice President of the Open Society Foundation. The world is in a different place from where it was 3 years ago, and the world of work into which many of you will be graduating is also different. A lot has shifted in the aftermath of the pandemic in terms of not just work, in terms of political economy and the way they organize. And we thought it would make sense to engage with that. And Lenny, in different capacities, in both professional and vocational capacities, has engaged with that on a comparative and international level for a long time. And we thought who best to help us understand how that change affects all of us and afflicts all of us with consequences across a whole slew of geographies and issues. And so part of what we'll be exploring is not just the post-pandemic world, but also the autocratization of the world around the world in the post-pandemic world. And it's my pleasure, therefore, to turn this over to them. You're welcome.
Chidi, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be here, but it's a special privilege for one reason, and that is you guys seem to have crushed soda, which is something outlawed by my children and my wife. Absolutely verboten. So I commend you for your risk of the reductive crush. Yes, so it is a great pleasure to be with my old comrade Chidi, and to speak for a little bit on a topic that may be not altogether optimistic or indeed forward-looking. I think that we need to, for the purposes of getting purchase on what has happened to global governance, international law, globalization, we need to look back maybe some 30 years and to trace why it is that the world today is so beset, as Chidi was noting briefly, by autocracy. How did this happen? When I began my work at the Open Society Foundations in the heady days of the 90s, everything seemed to be turning up positively. It seemed that international justice was on the ascent. The Rome Statute was being debated and countries were going to be signing on to it. And the whole idea of international justice that had in some ways its origins in Nuremberg was now going to be instantiated globally in a rather serious and demonstrative fashion. We looked at the European Union, 2004, 5, 6, and the accession to the European Union of a number of new member states from countries that had been part of, obviously, East Central Europe under state socialism, and countries like Poland or Czech Republic, Hungary, more surprisingly, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltics, Croatia were now entering this seemingly end of history union called the European Union. And in many ways, the people with whom I spend time with professionally and intellectually saw the European Union as the future. That soon enough, other parts of the world will see why the European Union, in terms of its norms and practices and principles and guarantees and the various institutions coursing through it, would be what the future portends. You know, we laugh a bit at Frank Fukuyama's end of history thesis, but in some ways it did seem that liberalism was on that last march. And the battle over ideas had reached at some level its end. When we look at the continent in Africa, when we look in Latin America, democracy itself was on the march too. If you follow or if you subscribe to these sort of various indices that I'm sure you're all confronted with, like the Freedom House Democracy Index, by the 1990s, there had never been before in human history so many countries labeled democratic. Democratic in the sense that elections were not able to be predicted ex ante or changed ex post. So it was a very sunny period. What happened? When we look at the world today in 2023, we see autocracies growing on every continent of the globe. Whether it's Xi in China or Erdogan in Turkey, or certainly Putin in Russia, or Netanyahu in Israel, or Trump in the United States, Lukashenko in Belarus, I mean, Orban in Hungary. The list goes on every continent. My very good friend, Mark Leonard, who runs the European Council on Foreign Relations, came out with a book in 2002 called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. To say that my good friend Mark has egg on his face is an understatement on stilts. So the question for us is what happened, and the subsequent question is, can it be repaired? You know, when I began at the Open Society Foundations in the 90s, George Soros very, very strongly felt that global governance was the future. International organizations, international regimes, all forms of multilateralism, cooperation was where it was at in solving collective action problems. But here we are 3 decades later, when these collective action problems, issues of such profound civilizational consequence, climate, pandemic, nuclear weapons, inequality, now have less cooperation than at any time in the last 30 years. So while we have moved into a period where global cooperation is more necessary than at any point in our lifetimes, the capacities to achieve that cooperation are as weak and fragile as any point in our lifetimes. This is a deeply, deeply regrettable and unfortunate paradox. Is there a way out of this? Well, the first thing we need to do is to understand what happened. Why is it that so much of the world turned to the so-called dark side? What happened? I might say, and I wonder if Chidi will disagree, but I think the institution that Chidi and I worked together for, the Open Society Foundations, for many years, has been complicit, if I may so provocatively, in this regrettable diminishment of democratic institutions and democratic practice and global cooperation. Why? It sounds odd. Everything the Open Society Foundations does is about human rights and justice and international order and engagement, et cetera. How could we be complicit? It seems slightly illusory. But what I would say is the following. When the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the implosion of the Soviet Union, happened in 1991, when we saw a string of countries in Latin America transitioning to, as the vernacular has it, democracy in the 1980s, when these really kind of cataclysmic events were happening, we didn't think about the social justice side of these transitions to any meaningful end. We looked at the political justice aspects of them, but not the social. I remember a friend of mine, David Reef, when the Arab uprisings happened, 2011 and 2012. David Reef is a prominent writer and commentator. David said to me, Lenny, please, please don't have the Open Society Foundation's only response to the Arab Spring be accountability. Please don't let that be the only response. He wasn't saying that wasn't important, but he recognized the Arab Spring began by a Tunisian food vendor self-immolating himself because he simply could find no way to practice his business without fundamental opposition and bureaucracy. And so the question of inequality, the question of equity, the question of fairness, the question of dignity, David Reef was implying to me, was far greater than just the question of accountability and justice. You know, we hear very often the slogan, no justice, no peace. Is that true? It's fair to interrogate. In any case, I see institutions like ours and many others who frankly did not have the proper receptivity to the fundamental questions of the unequal nature of so many societies undergoing forms of political transformation. Number one. Number two, as you can imagine, it was much easier for people like Chidi and me to be in touch with liberals. Liberals, they're nicer. They're not going to club you over the head or throw a tomato at you. They're open to, you know, all sorts of debate, discourse, deliberation, and the like. So why don't we just focus on liberals, right? Because they know and respect human rights regimes. They have a certain understanding about norms and principles, both domestically and globally. So our focus, by and large, became very much supporting liberals, liberal intellectuals at that, because we saw them as the harbingers of new societies. Yes, sort of workers and the petty bourgeois and sort of farmers, other agrarian classes, they'll come along once they see what the liberal intelligentsia has in store for them. Now, when I look back at that sort of conceit, I shudder. I shudder at the level of naivete. By the way, it was quite Leninist, if you want to think of it in those terms. It's a real Leninist orientation to assuming that there was going to be this vanguard group of liberals who were going to transform everything. Let's look at one case, Hungary. This, by the way, is the homeland of George Soros. He was born in Budapest. And so it meant a lot to him to return to Hungary and to establish a foundation in Hungary. But whom did we support in Hungary? You know, 175 well-intentioned, smart people that you would want to have dinner with and bring home to mother, liberals. Good people, smart people, committed people, but people who simply had blinders on when it came to looking at the broader carapace of society. You all remember Václav Havel, right? This the great dissident who had been jailed, who, when the then still Czechoslovakia became independent in 1989, became president. Now, what a heroic thing. Václav Havel, this great liberal intellectual who had suffered so, wrote poetry in prison, wanted Frank Zappa. Do you know what Frank Zappa is? Okay, these days, who knows Frank Zappa? Frank Zappa is a very prominent avant-garde musician. He wanted Frank Zappa to be his minister of culture. I mean, my God, who would not like Václav Havel? But what people forget still now is that Havel was a terrible politician. Terrible. Because the other side of Czechoslovakia, where Slovakia is today, had dinosaur industry. They saw the transition from communism, at least at one level, to be frightening. How are they going to survive in a kind of capitalist economy when they have these, long-standing subsidized industries that could never make it in the market economy they were entering into? Václav Havel didn't go over to Bratislava and say, don't worry, I got your back. It's going to be okay. We'll figure this out together. Why? Havel didn't want to deal with this sort of hoi polloi workers in Bratislava. He was hanging with the liberal elite that he was a part of. And so our blinders to questions of social stratification and inequality and social justice and worker rights and all of these things that paradoxically, at least in the case of the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe, were part of the rhetoric around and the ideology of state socialism. But that's another story. It was ignored. So the revolt of the non-elites became substantial. And when we look at Hungary today, 25, 30 years later, and we see Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is a troglodyte of the very first order, don't get me wrong, Viktor Orban was able to exploit and capitalize on all of the misgivings that people had around this kind of liberal elite standing tall and making decisions for the rest of the society. And what happened in this kind of interregnum moment was also, perhaps in hindsight, to be expected, which is the birth or rebirth of ethno-nationalism. There are very few card-carrying Marxists today who would look at class as the only category to define social relations and social change. Very few. Class remains important, but the ethnic dimension came back with a vengeance. And it came back with a vengeance, quite tragically, often towards what might be called the other. And in the case of Europe, if I can just stay with Europe for a second, the other was the largest minority group in Europe, the Roma. And despite every effort by the good liberals, whom we were supporting, to protect, educate, provide a sort of pathway to full membership in society for the Roma population, itself had great backlash. Why, the majorities would ask, are you constantly focused on the minorities? We're living in a majoritarian society, and why is your focus, and here the you is the liberals, why are you only focused on the vulnerable, the minority, the outcasts? Why aren't you focused on the majority? It wasn't an unfair question, but it was a question that did not dawn on the liberal elites confecting and creating these putatively new democratic states. So this is a malady, though. I just give European examples, but that is global. Let's look at India today. What happened to India, the largest democracy in the world, that has become, under its prime minister, Narendra Modi, a highly reactionary place. In the first instance, when it comes to the Muslim population, around 13% of India's 1.4 billion, under a kind of language of Hindu first, Hindu nationalism, Hindutva. How did this happen to the largest democracy on earth? And by the way, without a peep from the rest of the world. Charles Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader of the US Democratic Party, was at the Munich Security Conference the week before last and proudly proclaimed that he was on his way to Delhi to break bread with the leader of the largest democracy in the world, who had been persona non grata in the United States after the horrific massacre in Gujarat in 2002. How did this happen? Why is this happening? How did we lose, in the case of the US, our moral compass? A large part of that story, of course, is China. And the fear and loathing that we see in many quarters of the globe, and here I speak about not only Washington and Brussels and member states of the European Union. How did China become the second largest economy in the world such a bogeyman to the rest of the world? And is our friendship to India a function of the fear and loathing of India? Are we then back into a world of great power politics? Is that what we're inhabiting now, where 30 years ago was this time, this kind of efflorescence of democratic practice and liberal norms, and now liberalism seems to be at its desuetude. Democracy seems to be as narrow as it's ever been. Is there a way to get things back on track? And I'll sort of end maybe, because I'd like to just have a discussion with all of you. What will it take to put things back on track? My point of view is the following. I don't subscribe to the polarity of we live in a world where there's democracy and there's autocracy, and we need to fight to the finish, and one will win, and it's a gladiatorial fight, and either democracy will survive or autocracy will win out. I think that's a foolish and reductive and regrettable way of conceiving of global politics today. But it is, my friends, regrettably the mainstream. And if you listen to global elites and world leaders, and if you attend, God forbid, these sort of events like Davos and the Munich Security Conference, you will hear these bargain basement polarities being expressed continuously. I believe we need to think in a much more realistic, which doesn't mean less humanistic, fashion about living with autocracy. How can democracies continue to survive, can continue to be more competent and efficacious in what they do, but in a world that is saturated with autocracy? How can this be done? We hear about disinformation. And, I hear from the foundation world and the foreign office world, everyone's got a plan to get rid of disinformation. Everybody's got a plan. And I think all those plans are probably not worth more than a New York City subway token. Actually, there's no more subway tokens in New York. It's a Metro card now. But it's just a turn of phrase. But I believe, like with the notion of living with autocracy, we need to figure out how to live with disinformation. How can democracies not be undermined, not be emasculated by the devilish effectiveness of forms of disinformation? And it's about living with disinformation, not vanquishing it, because that's a fool's errand. We need to be realistic how we can spend our time and money, resources, intellectual effort, and all of that. So these are complicated questions. And the last point I'll make is about cooperation. There is no way on God's green earth that we in the rest of the world cannot work with China on questions of civilizational consequence. If you think that China can be marginalized from climate questions, you are facing a profound profound comeuppance in that notion. We must not forget, as people committed to human rights regimes, that what has happened in Xinjiang over these last years is of such catastrophic horror that it needs to be constantly addressed and reminded and underscored and, God willing, remediated at some point. We can't forget or ignore what has happened in Hong Kong over these last few years. We can't forget or ignore the way Xi Jinping is making himself a ruler for life. These are all deeply, deeply regrettable parts of the Chinese condition today, but neither can we not cooperate with China, because the rest of the world must, for the reasons of civilizational continuity. So any diplomat, I should hope, in good standing will tell you, you cannot just confront. You must compete, you must coordinate, and you must collaborate. Confront, yes, when done so appropriately. But we need to find ways to repair the idea of cooperation, because too much, way too much, is at stake. So let me stop there and thank you so much for listening, and look forward to a discussion.
That's covered a heck of a lot of real estate. And just as when you mentioned diplomats in good standing, I had to put on my glasses to look at one just across there. But we've got. When you were talking, I looked around the room, and we've got here New Zealand, China, USA, Pakistan, Colombia, Sri Lanka, Kenya, India, Myanmar, Switzerland, and Sweden. This is a mini United Nations. And I thought, who better to listen to this than this mini United Nations convened here? So the floor is open, actually. What we'll probably do is take them in clusters of 3 questions, reactions, comments, feedback, maybe 4, and then revert, get another set, and then maybe close. Please. Diplomat in good standing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for this very interesting talk. I think it was very interesting to hear from your point of view, also being in the business for so long and also seeing this transition.
Tell me where you're from.
I'm from Sweden.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would just, and my name is Christopher. So I would just like to ask you, where do you see Open Society Foundation in this new order? How are you going to work on the ground? Because also from a Swedish perspective, when it comes to development aid, in connection to democracy and human rights, civil society in those countries has of course been a very strong ally, and there has been criticism for working with autocratic government or semi-autocratic government. But how do you see and the work that you do is a little bit similar to what governments do when it comes to development aid and everything. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the future for your own organization.
Yeah, no, Chris. Oh, you're gonna take 3 questions.
Let's get a few more. Yes, Padmini.
My name is Padmini. I'm a lawyer from India. Thank you for such an insightful talk. So my question is, given that what you mentioned, the transition that has happened over the few decades, where do you see the role of international institutions fall in this whole gamut? Because if we were to ensure that we prevent any extreme political occurrences that we are seeing so far, so do you think what should be the role of multilateral organizations? And if they do have an important role to play, then do you see that evolving into an informal intergovernmental governance structure in the future, so that there are informal channels in which governance can be carried out for the flexibility and smoothness, etc.? Or do you see a supranational regime taking place or developing so that countries would be more inclined to fall in line if they were to deviate from certain democratic structures?
That's a very interesting question because Padmini is researching informal international organizations, right?
As Professor keeps reminding me.
It's a phenomenally fascinating question of international organizations. So it's important that she posed that question. Yes, Leonard.
Very thought-provoking delivery you just made. As an Indian, it really sets me to think. We were just hearing the ex-chairman of NTPC 15 minutes ago. NTPC is the organization in India which provides 20% of electricity of India. And the chairman said, in 2040, we should expect fossil fuel to peak in India. When we are talking of climate change right now. 2040, fossil fuel energy will continue to increase. Question is why? And he was very categorical. As per some records, 2.5 million people are dying out of hunger in India. 200 million in poverty and 70 million in abject poverty, getting 1 meal a day. In such times, when we are talking of democracy, to me as a lawyer, it means what does the majority think? I'm not talking of secularity. UK is a Christian country. My son is in UK. He wants to become a citizen of UK. He's a Hindu. So that's one part. Now, sir, my question. We as students of international law, we talk of UN Charter. For me, and this is where I would like your views, unless we can have a world constitution guaranteeing the fundamental rights or basic necessity to each individual, country regardless, I don't see how we will become a democracy globally. Thank you.
One more question. Any more? Okay, please.
Christian, remind me, your question was on
It was on the future, like
No,
how
the
open
OSF.
society.
future of OSF. Yeah. By the way, just let me ask you a question. Do you support Swedish entry into NATO?
Yes, of
You do.
course.
Why do you say of course?
Because there's been a fundamental change in circumstances of the security environment of Sweden.
Yeah.
And also, of course, our sister country, Finland, that has a 1,000-kilometer border with Russia, wanted to join. So I think those two.
Got it. I mean, the idea that Sweden, of all the places, of all the gin joints, would be joining NATO remains for me such a kind of unfathomable and improbable thing. I realize the scene has changed, but this is Sweden. But Christian, in terms of your question about where OSF is headed, I think OSF, to its detriment, has held on to a lot of kind of assumptions and practices that need refurbishment. Let's just take human rights. You know, I think it's incorrect to say, as some do, that say naming and shaming as a practice within the kind of human rights toolbox has become irrelevant. No, it hasn't become irrelevant. Just look at the dean of Harvard Kennedy School. He was named and shamed. But at the same time, it is fair to say that the last 20 years has been a bitter one for human rights actors and human rights movements because of the way that they have been sliced and diced at international institutions like the European Court on Human Rights, Council of Europe, and the way in which the kind of ideology around human rights has been so badly battered by a lot of autocratic states. And Russia in many ways was in the lead on this. So for us at OSF, where human rights is part of our DNA, it's part of our animating story, we need to figure out how to reorient our work so that we can be a partner to human rights communities in ways that will strengthen, buttress, and support the work that they're doing. But they as well on the ground need to think about all sorts of new approaches and methods and practices, because it's a very different world. And the human rights groups of old that would publish a report that would sit on a shelf, gather a bit of dust, maybe looked at by a graduate student or two, clearly is not going to be the force for change at any time soon. So human rights in general, in terms of its ability to be a necessary part of social change, we need to really think how to reorient ourselves. We're an institution that worked a lot on civil society. There's no question about that. And I still see civil society as the major social category that we will align ourselves with. But I do believe that when we think about the changes that require an extraordinary amount of private capital, that we need to work with institutions like the bank and the private sector generally, so that capital can be available for things like climate. The new head of the World Bank has said that he wants to double climate financing at the bank from $30 to $60 billion without touching any of those poverty funds. I'd like to tell him that I got a bridge to sell him in New York, but maybe he'll pull it off, but he won't pull it off unless he has access to leverage private capital markets in the way that Mr. Macron, the president of France, wants. So I do think working with the private sector is going to be quite important as well. I think the other change at OSF in our work is a recognition that the era of neoliberalism has come to its terminus. But what comes next? And how do you confect a new, whatever you want to call it, mode of production, accumulation regime, some post-neoliberal order? How is that done? If we look today in Latin America, in the new governments in Chile, Colombia, and Brazil, there's a lot of hope in these countries under Boric and Lula and Gustavo Petro, that they're going to be developing, with the help of others, a kind of social democratic new industrial economy and welfare state ripe for the 21st century. Now, there's a lot of excitement in Colombia and Chile and Brazil, but there's a lot of concern too that if it doesn't happen, we return to a different period. So I think that my hope is that we're investing a lot in Brazil, and Chile, where we have a lot of friends, former grantees, that are now sitting in the Ministry of Interior, in the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Education. And there are opportunities for the kind of work we would like to see advanced through these specific interventions. So I think on the human rights side, on the post-neoliberal side, on the private sector side, those are three areas that OSF has to refashion itself so as to be to remain relevant in the current climate, if that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Do you like Bergman?
Huh?
Ingmar Bergman?
Ingmar, you love
Okay, good. It's good. Yes, Swedish director. Very good. I commend to all of you. On the institution side, I'm not particularly sanguine. I have to be honest. It's going to require a level of collective action and collective responsibility that multilateral institutions, and only they, can really, really overcome collective action problems that are going to save us from catastrophic disaster. Some element of informality, I do think, will ultimately be necessary, because the kind of, take the Global Fund for TB, HIV, and malaria, which had been a very, I think, significant international regime, and had enormous significance. The idea that you could set up today, the way our world is currently organized, something of such consequence like the Global Fund, I just don't see it. And I think that it is for me, a sort of desideratum that China is at the table. India has to be at the table. You know, the greatest step forward in achieving forms of global cooperation, in my estimation, would be making the Security Council a more plural body. It is beyond reproach. It is beyond any sense of human decency. It's beyond any sense of rationality that the Security Council remains what it is today. It makes no sense. But unfortunately, we all know and understand the challenges of making that change. I think that that would be of enormous importance if Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia became part of the Security Council, Germany. But I wish I were not as deeply skeptical as I am. But I look at my colleagues, Chidi's former colleagues, who talk about setting up an independent tribunal to try Russians in this catastrophic war with Ukraine, because as you know, Russia, and by the way, not even Ukraine, are signatories of the Rome Statute, not even Ukraine. So this discussion about setting up some independent tribunal, I think it's going to go nowhere fast. It hurts me because I'm a very staunch advocate of international justice, but it's been so badly emasculated in the first instance because the United States is not a party to it. And I just think these so-called great powers must become part of collective institutions like the ones you refer to, formally and informally, for us to have any hope in their future. There are those more pessimistic than I that say, look, democracy, it's just a blip. Look at human history. Democracy is nothing. 30 years, 50 years. It's just a brief moment. Glad to have lived through it, but we're just going back to the sort of historical normal. I don't take that view because otherwise I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. But I do think we need to confront some of those realities too. Narendra, what can I tell you? Tell me again. Your question was whether there can be some sort of overarching
Constitution, world constitution guaranteeing minimum necessities to each human being.
Yeah, good luck. What can I tell you? I don't see it. I can't imagine it. I think it's a very, very important thing to be aspirational towards, even utopian, but I don't see it in our lifetimes. I can't imagine it. From whom? From what resources? How? India, by the way, has done quite well, in the past at least, with its kind of rural guarantee employment program and all of that. I think India, sad as it is today, has some real models to offer the world. But in terms of something of a global kind along those lines, sorry.
And Virendra, you don't see the UN Charter as that constitution.
So because it is not guaranteeing the necessities. For me, the challenge is food. That's what I'm not seeing anywhere. And the solution actually, if sir would permit, is only with the global north. Yeah. We have a social security number here, but we don't have the social security number for, say, as per the World Bank, about 600 million people are going to be struggling with hunger even in 2030.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got two more hands. And Simon. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Leah from Burma. Thank you so much for your insightful talks. I really fascinated by democracy versus autocracy compete and cooperate. So yeah, like now as Burma is kind of like in a very disaster crisis, and especially institutions or civil societies like have withdrawn from operating there in light of security concerns, and some are still engaging with the autocratic regimes. And so like US and DAA passed the bill recently that include Burma bill, which stated that non-actors like People Defense Force or ethnic armed organizations to support non-lethal assistance, which was interesting. And I would like to hear your text on supporting those non-state actors in challenging autocratic regimes. And like also some institutions especially are arguing to cooperate and in the like coming planned elections, and to engage in preliminary like premature engagement with autocracy also would enable the future, like also challenge the future kind of like a democratic governance. So I would like to hear your view on that, to engage either with the non-state actors who are challenging the autocracy.
Jeffrey?
I have three very related questions. So number one, how has democracy failed to deliver social justice? And you talked about that in the early 2000s, the world focused more on political justice, right? And did not look at this and undermined the social aspect of development. So I wonder, I mean, issues that concern social justice are maybe issues like land, food, a sense of self-determination culturally, or maybe religion, right? So where do you draw the line between what is political justice and what is social justice? And then finally, so autocrats have capitalized on these social grievances to get to power through populism. And so I wonder, have civil societies considered doing the same thing, politicizing social grievances to address that better, to beat autocracy? So a focus on just politicizing, making it a political discussion.
By autocrats.
No, even thinking about solutions to or a challenge to autocracy by using the same tool.
I see.
Ariana, Rachel, and Emily.
Can I just start with these two real quickly?
Okay.
Because I'll forget everything. Just super quick. First on your questions and then Leon after. First, I would say that on your first point, which is an interesting one, I think that having democracies deliver and to show why democracies are not what they have been cast to be by the autocracies of the world, slow moving, filled with bureaucratic challenge, unable to arrive at a particular policy decision because it requires all sorts of, participatory interventions. That's been a gold mine for a lot of autocracies who are able to make decisions without debate. So I think that the burden right now, frankly, is on democracies to show why, in fact, in terms of development issues, that democracy can be a far stronger force for advancing development, not just ethically and fairly and equitably, but just in terms of the outcomes too. It's a long haul. It's not going to be easy. But if you look at the literature on development democracy, which is voluminous, you will see that over time, democracies are better delivering on these things because they have, by and large, access to information, broad public access to information, capacities to debate, capacities to right wrongs, to zig instead of zag. If zagging didn't prove fruitful, there's that possibility that a much more kind of immutable or stultifying autocratic set of policies can't. But this hasn't been as available in the debate for autocracies that it needs to be. And so I think making democracies work, you hear that a lot these days, because I think there's a recognition that that's the sort of order of the day. In terms of using some of the tools of autocrats on populism and other things for democratic advantage, I'll just use one: corruption. We know that the world over, autocrats use corruption as a way to show how democracies are inattentive to how things are governed, that people get sweetheart deals because they're friends of so-and-so. Look at the Trump administration and the level of corruption that happened within an ostensibly democratically elected president. But I think for democracies, the question about the costs of corruption can be far more effectively and in a populist way imparted. People have become so tired about hearing corruption, they're inured to it, it washes over them because they see it as just part of life. Rather than being explicit that the $1 billion that was stolen in Moldova or in Malaysia, that those funds could have gone to, and itemize it, 40,000 schools, 8 million school textbooks, 19 new hospitals. Once people begin to see in much more explicit, tangible, palpable ways what the costs of corruption are, this has, according to a lot of sort of advocates and civil society actors, seen as one